I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast, and on this channel I do videos about historical true crime and mysteries. Today we're finally getting back to the Black Dahlia case. My last video on this case came out in January and covered Elizabeth Short's background and the details of her murder, so definitely rewatch that one if you need to refresh your memory. In this video, I'll be covering theories and suspects in the case. Before we get into things, I do want to give some content warnings. This video will contain discussions of violence against women and sexual assault, as well as discussions of child sexual abuse once we get into the suspects' backgrounds. So please use your discretion in watching and prioritize your mental health first and foremost. First up, I want to start by going into the suspects who had the most personal connection with Elizabeth, starting with Red Manley, the last person to see her alive. I talked about Elizabeth's interaction with Red a lot in the last video, but I'll recap it a little bit here. Red was having marriage troubles and looked at Elizabeth as a test of if he was still in love with his wife. He reported that nothing sexual happened with Elizabeth, and that after dropping her off, he went back to his wife, who forgave him. Red claimed to be in San Francisco at the time of the murder. He was questioned by police, who were satisfied with his story and his alibi and cleared his name. One of the biggest things that strike me as fishy about the way that Red Manley was questioned, though, is the methods that police were using during these interrogations. Granted, this is the 1940s, and they're working with 1940s investigative methods, but today we know that a lot of those are ineffective. I could go on a whole rant about pseudoscience and forensics, but that could easily be its own video, so let me know if you want to see that. The most convincing evidence that police had at the time to clear Manley was that he passed 2 lie detector tests, and he was questioned under the effects of sodium pentothal. Today, we know that lie detector tests don't actually determine if you're lying, they just determine if you're nervous, and that sodium pentothal isn't actually a truth serum, it's just a sedative that lowers your inhibitions. My biggest question about Red Manley is about his motives. His behaviors as he dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel really just rubbed me the wrong way. He seemed to be really unwilling to leave her alone, and she even had to make up a story to get away from him. Was he really just concerned about her safety, or was he resentful that she didn't have sex with him? The other big name I mentioned in the last video is Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who had a habit of inviting young women to stay with him, and the man Elizabeth lived with in late 1946. Mark is the one who gave her the address book that was later mailed with the rest of her belongings. He's been a big suspect in the case from the start, and he was questioned by police several times. One of the things that I found really interesting about Mark was that friends and associates of his who were questioned said that he was very interested in Elizabeth, but when he was asked about it, he downplayed his interests. When others who lived at the house were questioned, they said that Mark really liked Elizabeth, that he gave her several gifts, and he even had another tenant make custom dresses for her. It was also reported that Mark was very jealous, and Elizabeth would have to secretly meet her boyfriends at the end of the street, away from the house, to avoid making him upset. When police questioned Mark, however, it was a totally different story. He not only claimed to not be interested in her, saying that it would be ridiculous for him to be interested in every woman who stayed with him, but he even went as far as to insult her looks. He also claimed that Elizabeth stole the address book from him instead of him giving it to her as a present. The way he talks about her, it makes me think of the phenomenon that happens a lot today, where a man will slide into a woman's DMs desperate to talk to her, and then the woman will reject him, and he'll instantly flip the switch on her and call her ugly and say he was never interested in her anyway. I couldn't find any kind of alibi for Mark Hansen, and it looks like he was never fully cleared of being a suspect. Police at the time didn't think it was likely that he was the killer due to his lack of criminal record and respectability as a business owner, but personally, I wonder if the fact that he was so well connected lent itself to a cover-up. Interestingly, a lot of the theories surrounding Mark Hansen are about the idea that maybe he didn't kill her himself, but he either connected her to her killer or outright ordered her to be killed. So let's get into some of those theories. Patrick O'Reilly was a friend of Mark Hansen's who met Elizabeth when Mark would take her to parties. A big factor in why Patrick was a suspect for the murder is his background. He was a doctor, and police theorized that the killer would have to be a doctor or have medical training in order to achieve the precise bisection of Elizabeth's body. Patrick also had a history of sexual violence. Previously, he took his secretary to a hotel room. When she refused to have sex with him, he beat her nearly to death. Patrick O'Reilly was never charged, but something I find interesting is that he was also married to one of the LAPD captain's daughters. Now, isn't that convenient? Frustratingly enough, police might have actually had the killer in custody and then messed it all up. Leslie Dillon was a hotel bellhop who oddly involved himself in the investigation of this case. In December of 1948, after Dillon had moved from LA to Florida, he wrote a letter under a fake name to Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, who was a psychiatrist working for the LAPD. Dillon had some theories about the psychological profile of the Black Dahlia murderer and some of the methods that the killer might have used. Upon reading Dillon's letter, DeRiver had a new suspect of his own, Dillon himself. Dr. DeRiver continued to write to Dillon to gain his trust, and the two agreed to meet in Las Vegas to discuss the case. DeRiver ended up bringing along 2 undercover LAPD cops. Dillon had some ideas about how the killer might have drained the blood from Elizabeth's body. In the past, he had been a mortuary worker at a funeral home in Oklahoma, and his theory was that the blood was drained in a similar method to how it would be when he was embalming a body, by making an incision in the upper thigh and inserting a tube to drain the blood. Dillon also told the psychiatrist in graphic detail about a potential sexual motive for the killer cutting Elizabeth's body in half. The way he described these things sounded as if he had committed the murder himself. Dr. DeRiver and the cops thought they had their guy. The only problem was they weren't there on official police business doing an actual interrogation. The case against Dillon was entirely circumstantial at that point, and they didn't have cause to arrest him. That didn't stop them, however, and following this, DeRiver and the cops essentially kidnapped Dillon and took him back to LA. Under the pretense of taking Dillon back to Dr. DeRiver's office to talk about the case, DeRiver and the 2 undercover cops drove Dillon from Las Vegas to LA. On the way to the office, Dillon started directing the cop posing as DeRiver's driver slightly out of their way to avoid the Crenshaw neighborhood, but the cop instead took them straight to the empty lot where Elizabeth's body was found. DeRiver claimed that Dillon became noticeably agitated when they were in the empty lot, and he started talking about other murder cases in the area, potentially in an attempt to distract Dr. DeRiver from asking him about the case at hand. From this point on, Dillon presumably knew what was going on as he became increasingly nervous. He named another suspect in the murder, Jeff Connors. Based on their encounter, DeRiver was convinced that Dillon was either schizophrenic or had some other kind of mental illness, and that Jeff Connors wasn't actually real. Keep the name Jeff Connors in mind for just a little bit, though. We'll talk a bit more about that later. DeRiver and the cops ended up not being able to find any information about this new suspect, and they ended up bringing Leslie Dillon to the police station for questioning instead. He was booked as a suspect in the case on January 10th of 1949. Interestingly, it seems that Dr. DeRiver wasn't the only person who thought that Dillon made a good suspect. Mark Hansen, the suspect we talked about earlier, told police about a man he saw pick Elizabeth up from his house about 6 or 7 times. Police, thinking the description of this man that Hansen was describing sounded a lot like Leslie Dillon, showed a picture of him to Hansen, who admitted that Dillon did look very similar to the man he was talking about. Ultimately, the police couldn't get any solid evidence that Dillon was actually involved in the murder. Furthermore, witnesses came forward who said that Dillon was in San Francisco for almost the whole month of January 1947, and therefore he couldn't have committed the murder. Police cast doubt on the credibility of these witnesses, but since they couldn't find a reason to keep Dillon in custody, they ended up having to let him go. Following this, Dillon ended up suing the city of Los Angeles for $100,000 because of what happened with Dr. DeRiver and the cops. Another theory that I found particularly fascinating is the theory that Elizabeth Short's murder was part of a big conspiracy involving both Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen, and the truth was covered up by corrupt LAPD cops who were in Hansen's pocket. This theory was proposed by author Bute Eatwell in her book Black Dahlia, Red Rose. According to the theory, Dylan and Mark Hansen were partners in a hotel robbery scheme, which involved Dylan posing as a bellboy at various hotels to find out where their safes were kept and to gain knowledge of the hotel's security measures. Shortly after starting, he would quit, and then days later, he and his crew would go in and rob the hotel. Remember Jeff Connors, the suspect Dylan named to police when he was questioned? Eatwell proposes that not only was Jeff Connors real, but that he was involved in this scheme. Supposedly, the trouble started when Elizabeth was staying with Mark Hansen, where she found evidence of this hotel robbery scheme he was involved in. From there, the theory goes that she was kidnapped, tortured, and killed by Leslie Dillon at the behest of Mark Hansen. During the police questioning of Dillon, he volunteered the information that he thought Elizabeth was killed at a hotel. Eatwell's theory names the hotel in question the Astor Motel. During the time when Elizabeth was missing, the owners of the Astor Motel reported finding one of their rooms covered in blood and fecal matter, and a bundle of bloody clothes left in the room, including both men's and women's clothes. A witness also reported that Leslie Dillon stayed at the hotel during this time. As compelling as this theory is, there's not really any hard evidence to prove it. There's nothing proving that Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen even knew each other, much less the hotel robbery scheme or that Elizabeth knew anything about any illegal business dealings that Hansen was involved in. There's no physical evidence from the hotel, as the owners of the hotel burned the linens and clothes when they cleaned up the room. And even so, there's nothing to connect that incident in the hotel room to the murder in the first place. If Leslie Dillon was involved in the murder, he'd never be charged for it because of how badly the police bungled the investigation of him. In his lawsuit in 1949, the judge ruled that there was no conclusive evidence to charge any suspect in the crime, much less Leslie Dillon. One theory about this case that I'm really interested in is that Elizabeth's murder was the work of a serial killer. And it makes sense. This murder is so elaborate and the crime scene cleanup was so thorough, it's hard to imagine that this would be someone's first murder, or their last. In February of 1947, about a month after Elizabeth Short's body was found, another woman was found dead under very similar circumstances. Jean French was a 44-year-old woman who also had dark hair, similar to Elizabeth, and was also found murdered in a similar way, with similar injuries and blood loss. One of the biggest possible connections to this case, however, was the message written on her body in red lipstick. "Fuck you, BD." People were quick to conclude that BD must stand for Black Dahlia. There wasn't much else to go on, though, and like Elizabeth Short, Jean French's murder has also remained unsolved. One of the suspects that's gotten the most attention in recent years is Dr. George Hodel, and the man accusing him of the murder is none other than his own son, former LAPD detective Steve Hodel. George Hodel was a doctor who was running a venereal disease clinic in Los Angeles around the time of the murder. This profession actually explains a lot about how he could have come into contact with Elizabeth, how he could have murdered her, and how he could have arranged for it to be covered up. Because of Hodel's clinic, he was well acquainted with LA's sex work industry and the patrons who frequented it. Elizabeth wasn't a sex worker, but given her situation of being homeless, bouncing around from house to house, and relying on dating men in order to eat, it's not hard to imagine that both her and Hodel would run in similar circles. As for the murder itself, while Hodel wasn't a surgeon, he did study surgery in medical school in the 1930s, and he was reportedly very good at it. A common theory in the investigation at the time was that the Black Dahlia murderer would have had to have surgical knowledge to bisect the body in the way that he did, and Hodel would have had the knowledge to do this. Thirdly, his work put him in contact with very rich and powerful people who were trusting him with information about their sex lives. This made him not only incredibly wealthy, but gave him plenty of information to potentially blackmail some powerful people with. It's easy to imagine he could have somehow bribed or blackmailed the right person and gotten the whole thing covered up. But why would Steve Hodel suspect his father of the murder in the first place? Let's go back and analyze George Hodell's character and his potential motives for murder. Steve was one of 11 children that his father had. George's daughter, Tamar, alleged a history of horrific sexual abuse at the hands of her father from the time she was about 11 to her early teens. According to Tamar, Hodell would not only abuse her himself, but allow his friends to do so as well. George Hodell was friendly with surrealist artist Man Ray. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a bit, but the important part here is that Tamar alleged that her father had her pose for nude photographs for Man Ray when she was a child. In 1949, Tamar came forward with her story, but unfortunately, George Hodell was acquitted of the incest charges after he got other members of the family to testify on his behalf and say that Tamar was lying about the abuse. Back to Man Ray, Hodell was a big fan of his work, and this might have to do with the manner in which Elizabeth was killed. While the nature of the torture she endured and the fact that her body was found naked also indicate a sexual motive for the murder, which wouldn't be out of the realm of belief for Hodell considering everything else that he did, there's a theory that Hodell was also hinting at being inspired by Man Ray. The way that Elizabeth's body was posed in the lot where she was found, as well as the cuts on her face, are similar to some of the imagery found in certain works of Man Ray's. So far, all we have is a circumstantial case, but now I want to go through all the evidence that convinced Steve Hodell that his father was the Black Dahlia killer. After George Hodell's death in 1991, Steve was going through his father's belongings when he found some old photographs that caught his attention. In a photo album, Steve found a picture of a beautiful woman with striking dark hair that he was certain was Elizabeth Short. Looking at the photo myself, I can see why he'd think that, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's her. Neither were facial recognition experts who analyzed the photo. Steve has hired experts to analyze the photo at least twice. One was mostly sure that it was her, and the other was mostly sure that it wasn't her. Steve also thought that his father's handwriting was strikingly similar to the handwriting on the letters that were sent to the newspapers and the police during the initial investigation. He hired a handwriting expert to compare his father's handwriting with the handwriting on these notes, and the expert came to the same conclusion that Steve did. Convinced that his father was indeed the Black Dahlia murderer, Steve Hodell released a book detailing his findings in 2003 called Black Dahlia Avenger. Not content to stop there, Steve Hodell is still investigating the case to this day to try to find more conclusive evidence. In 2012, he had cadaver dogs come to his childhood home, and they did identify the scent of human remains on the property. However, this doesn't necessarily connect to the Black Dahlia case, as it doesn't tell us when the human remains were on the property or whose remains they were. No actual digging has been done on the property to investigate this further. Steve Hodell wasn't actually the first person to think that George Hodell was responsible for the murder, however. During Steve's investigation, it came out that his father was a suspect at the time of the initial investigation as well. In 1950, the LAPD bugged Hodell's home for a period of 5 weeks to gather evidence, and some of the things that they heard are extremely suspicious. One night, a woman is heard screaming in the home. On another occasion, Hodell is heard speaking to another man, saying, "This is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement agencies. I'd like to get a connection made in the DA's office." Later in that same conversation, Hodell speaks about his recent trial for the incest charges. "They're out to get me," he says. "2 men in the DA's office were transferred and demoted because of my trial." And perhaps the most shocking part of the conversation, Hodell actually references the Black Dahlia case. "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia," he says. "They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Part of Steve's theory is that his father was not only the Black Dahlia murderer, but a serial killer. He's also connected the murder of Jean French, who we talked about a bit earlier, to this case. Steve's case for this goes back to the handwriting. The handwriting expert who concluded that George Hodell's handwriting was a match to the letters also concluded that it was a match to the message written in lipstick on Jean French's body. In 1950, George Hodel made a sudden and unexplained move to the Philippines. Since his incest trial had just happened in 1949, it's possible that he just wanted to get away from his family for a while and let the heat from that calm down, but it is also suspicious that this happened so soon after the LAPD tapped his home. There are parts of those transcripts where Hodel seems aware that the police are listening in, so it's possible that this move was done to escape police surveillance. Steve Hodel also connects his father to the murder of Lucila Lulu. Lucila was found murdered in Manila in 1967, and her body was found mutilated in a similar way to both Elizabeth's and Jean's. Eerily, the site where her body was found was less than a mile away from where Hodel was living at the time. Now, there's a lot of information and theories out there that make George Hodel look extremely suspicious, so I just want to walk it back a little bit and talk about some of the reasons to have some reservations about this theory. Steve's case, while compelling, is almost entirely circumstantial. There's no evidence to prove that his father even knew Elizabeth. There's no physical evidence to back it up either. There's never been any hair, fibers, or other DNA evidence found that could connect Elizabeth's body back to Hodel. There's also no physical evidence that places Elizabeth in Hodel's home at the time of the murder, and no evidence that she'd ever been there at all. Steve's credibility has also taken a hit in recent years, based on some of his accusations towards his father, leading some to wonder if this investigation is part of a personal vendetta. Steve has also tried to connect his father to various other unsolved murders, most famously the Zodiac murders, which, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense. While the cases are similar in that both the Black Dahlia murderer and the Zodiac killer wrote letters, that's just about the only thing they have in common. The MO of the Zodiac murders is completely different, from the profiles of the victims to the methods used. In my personal opinion, while Steve's case is compelling, it doesn't make it 100% certain that his father is the killer. I definitely believe Tamar's claims of abuse. I definitely believe that this guy was a horrifically abusive father. I do believe that it's not a stretch of the imagination that he could have killed someone. I even think it's possible that he's the Black Dahlia murderer. I'm just not 100% sure that it's him. Regardless of which of these theories that you believe, to me there seems to be a pattern emerging, that the answer somehow relates to police corruption. Personally, it doesn't take a lot for me to become suspicious of the police, but in this case in particular, there's a lot of mysterious happenings in the investigation that have a lot of people wondering if the police were somehow either involved in the murder or if they covered it up. There are a lot of instances in these theories that could be chalked up to incompetence or overzealousness, like the incident with Leslie Dillon, but at a certain point it's questionable whether some of the LAPD's actions are driven by incompetence or malice. One of the biggest things cited in a lot of these theories is the fact that almost all of the physical evidence in this case seems to have mysteriously disappeared. It's not just items like the bloody linens and the clothes found in the Astor Motel, it's items that were last seen in police custody, like items found with the body or sent in by the killer. Even with the police wiretapping George Hodel's home in 1950, that evidence has gone missing as well. The information that we have from what was heard comes from transcripts of the recordings, but the recordings themselves are nowhere to be found. Right now, we mostly just have theories based on circumstantial evidence and shaky witness testimony that don't add up to much, but the physical evidence that could back up any one of these theories is simply not there, which makes the possibility of officially solving this case very slim. Thanks so much for watching the second part of this series, and I'm so sorry that it came so long after the first, but thanks for being patient with me. I went down like 1,000 rabbit holes during this case, so there might possibly be a part 3 on some of the weirder theories I found. Let me know if you'd like to see that, or if you're wondering about any aspect of the case. Coming up next will most likely be a new cryptid video. It's been a while since I've done one of those, and I like doing cryptid videos as kind of a palate cleanser for the true crime stuff, so definitely look forward to that. Thanks so much to my Ko-Fi supporters, Ruby, Tofi, Salika, Lotus, Smalzy, and Andara. I appreciate you all so much. You can see all my videos early and watch extra exclusive videos by supporting me on Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/Lynn Blend. Thanks so much for watching.